Okay, so here we go with session 23. Last Sunday, uh, just a moment. Yeah, last Sunday we had session 22 and we were on chapter 11. We had just started, okay, just part of the chapter we have done. We have seen how Jesus enters, okay, triumphantly into Jerusalem, and the entire 40 resonances as to how he would be entering the holy city of Jerusalem as a triumphant king, but king not in the sense of the world, a humble king who would come riding on a donkey. And then we have seen how, like, these things were prophesied in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Prophet Zechariah. Today, we ended the session with, Jesus coming triumphantly into Jerusalem, and finally he comes to the temple. But it is quite late evening, and the temple is almost not exactly empty, we could say, but the worship and the sacrifices are all over. So Jesus then goes that evening back to Bethany. Now we are into the second day of his journey. He goes to Bethany, okay, stays overnight. We do not know exactly where, because he had quite a number of disciples. Some of them are named, some of them are not really named. So wherever he stayed, early in the morning, he makes it to the temple the next day. And today we are going to have the scene of the cleansing, which is a very climactic event, because this is the one that finally hastened his death and took him finally to the mission that he had come to accomplish in the world. So here we carry on with session 23, continuation of chapter 11. We begin from verses 12 where we had stopped. Now, when Jesus is coming towards the temple, on the way, normally whenever they had to go to the temple, it used to be early in the morning. So Jesus, along with his, company of disciples, he must have left very early on to come to the temple. So on the way, Jesus comes across a fig tree. Let us read the text of the gospel. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season of figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. This literally cursing of Jesus, cursing the fig tree. Hence, in the end, when he goes looking out for figs, the tree is in full leaf, but there is no fruit. And so he curses the fig tree. Now, this event in the Gospel of Mark is quite a very strange event, because this is the only time we see, okay, Jesus engaging in an act which equates to cursing. Not exactly the way the world would curse, but something very harsh, something that is not akin to his normal gentle nature. And when we talk about the fig tree is normally like this, okay, we have all commonly seen how the figs are available, and mostly the dried figs are very much in demand. So a fig tree normally is in blossom during summer, not so much during the springtime. So let us break down what is the reason why does Jesus in the first place, okay, come looking for figs when it wasn't really the season of figs. And Mark takes a lot of care to tell us in his text that it wasn't the season for figs. So if it wasn't the season for figs, this action of Jesus, like cursing the fig tree, saying that it will never bear fruit again, it sounds very harsh and very strange. Let us see why. That's the reason behind it. Mark makes it clear it wasn't a season for figs, but the text actually does not say figs. Have you noticed in the text it is mentioned he came looking for something on it, means the fruit of it. But that Jesus came looking for fruit, and there's a reason for that. In the actual Greek text, the word that is used is fruit, not figs. Summertime is actually the time when the fig tree blossoms. It is in full bloom. In summer, that is late summer, is normally June, July. But in spring is normally the time, the present time, like how we have now, March, April is considered to be springtime. And this used to be the season that is, where the Passover is very, very close. So summertime is actually the time for fig trees to blossom and throw out its rich fruit, because you'll see the fruits grow in big clusters. So it is a tree that yields a very rich yield of fruits, figs. But in summer, in spring, they just put out, they put forth leaves, and by the Passover season, there's only foliage, lot of foliage. It is, a tree that will usually not shed all its leaves. So you will find the tree in full foliage. There will be leaf cover is there. But with the leaves at around this point of time, it seems the fig tree actually gives out to harvest. One harvest is a full summer harvest, okay, with the full figs, okay, the sweet ones, very nice and tasty, they are harvested. But prior to that, in the spring season, okay, there is something called a pre-fig, a fruit called the pakim in the Hebrew language. And what is it? This is not exactly, it seems, a full fig. It is something that is, prior to the coming of the fig. And this normally, it seems, when they harvest the full fruit in summer, the tree throws out some nodes. And these are the nodes that ripen, and they are available for eating. They are edible, not very tasty, but they are edible. They are available for eating around springtime. This pre-fig fruit is also called brevas in Spanish mostly, and this is not very tasty, but it is edible. If you are very hungry and looking out to satisfy, to satiate your hunger, this is good enough. So it's a fruit, but not the normal kind of figs that are ready for harvesting in summer, which are normally very sweet and tasty. So Jesus is going to have, why does he get very annoyed? He is probably very hungry. He has left the house very early in the morning, and he is going to have a very challenging, arduous day in the temple. We will see how he comes head on, okay? The temple cleansing act, which is supposed to be the harshest one, where Jesus comes in direct confrontation with the Jerusalem priesthood. Okay, so he has probably missed breakfast. He is human. Let us remember that. He has probably missed his breakfast. He is hungry, and that's why he comes to the fig tree, okay, looking for the pre-fig fruit called the pakim. He is hungry, so he just wants something to eat, and that's the reason he comes to the tree. But all that he sees is a fig tree lying barren with only foliage to show. So the tree is nicely, okay, in full blossom, not with fruit, but only with foliage. And that's the reason Jesus curses the fig tree. But there's a deeper meaning behind it. All throughout the gospel, we have seen Jesus always caring for the people, and especially when they are hungry. He has also multiplied food and made it available to them in the wilderness. We have seen 2 occasions how he multiplied bread and fish and made it available for the people who were hungry following him. And he is hungry right now, but he is not expecting fully ripe figs which will come in the new year. So definitely Jesus is a realistic person. So he's definitely not looking out for the full fig, but he's looking out for at least the pre-fig, the pakim, which would be available. So we have here a very striking image, okay, of something very harsh that is done by Jesus. Compare them with the striking images of Jesus' compassion, which is so much manifested in all the acts, his healings, his kingdom, okay, his kingdom language and blessings. Everywhere he went, he only blessed, blessed, blessed. He healed the people, restored them to fullness, to full health, blessed children. So you always, we find Jesus in the act of bringing the love of God, making the compassion of God present to mankind. So this cursing the fig tree is a very startling contrast to his nature. So why does he then say, you will never bear fruit again? Here, when we look at this episode, the way Mark has put it, if you see, this is on the way to Jerusalem. He's looking for fruit, there's no fruit, and then he lashes onto the tree, cursing it. Then he goes into the temple and then back again. When they are coming back, we will be seeing later on, when they were coming back after the temple cleansing episode, Peter and the disciples, they find that this fig tree has withered completely. That means, in simple words, it has actually died. So here, this is a parabolic act. It is an active parable, or we can call an act of parable. Through this action, he is actually demonstrating something very deep and significant. He is about to cleanse the temple to address a morally and spiritually corrupt establishment that has leaves and pretends to have fruit but doesn't have any. And what is that establishment? The aristocratic Jerusalemite priesthood with whom Jesus will come in head-on confrontation. So the fig tree here is a symbol of the temple leadership which has failed in its mission and purpose. So Mark uses this incident to frame the pericope of the temple cleansing episode. It is this temple cleansing episode which is the pivotal action of Jesus. So this action of Jesus, okay, which puts him in a direct collision course with the temple establishment and hastens his death. This is the key episode which is framed by this, okay, episode of the fig tree. So on the way, they come across a fig tree. On the way back, they see that the fig tree is dead. So it is a typical Markan sandwich. You remember one of the literary key features of Mark's gospel is he likes to put, episodes in this way. He likes to frame a key episode with other little smaller ones in order to make the middle episode more effective, to highlight the significance, the importance of it. So this is a typical Markan sandwich. Let us go further. In the Bible, okay, the Bible describes learning from a rabbi as sitting at his feet. This we come across in the Act of the Apostles, where Paul is supposed to have learned at the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel. So in the Bible, we have ample testimony, okay, for this phrase, sitting at the feet of a rabbi meant that you are learning, okay, like an apprentice, you are learning under, okay, sitting at the feet of a rabbi, you are learning the Torah. So which was often done in the synagogues as well as in temple colonnades. Temple was a very huge place. So in the colonnades, okay, it was very normal to find, rabbis with their group of disciples engaged in Torah learning. But even more common than that was, a sight which was very common in Judea, also in Galilee, where sitting at the rabbi's feet was also done under fig trees. Not only because of the shade it provided, but also because the tree's sweet fruit. So soon, this became a sort of an idiom, under the fig tree. Became an idiom for one who sits under the shade of a rabbi's teaching, enjoying the sweet fruit of his instruction and wisdom. Remember in the Gospel of John, okay, when Nathaniel, Philip tells Nathaniel, he invites him to come and have a look at Jesus, okay, and Nathaniel is very skeptical. What good can come of Nazareth? He is very famous retort. And then when finally he does come to Jesus, what does Jesus tell him? I saw you under the fig tree, and that is what brings about the transformation. So what was Nathaniel actually doing? He probably was engaged in Torah learning under maybe some rabbi, but we know that he was also a follower of John the Baptist. So whatever it is, under the fig tree had a very symbolic meaning. It was, showing like it demonstrated a person who's engaged in Torah learning, trying to savor the rich wisdom and instruction of the Torah. So this became a very enduring symbol of, learning of Torah under the fig tree. This is another one. Jewish sources speak of rabbis who pursued their studies by discussing and debating the meaning of scripture with their colleagues and students under the cool shade of a fig tree. So the fig tree here, when Jesus is cursing the fig tree, okay, the fig tree here is a symbol of all that the temple establishment stood for. Its cultus, the entire worship, the sacrificial cult of the temple, it had become a very corrupt, okay, practice. And we will see why Jesus was so very fiery and the way he denounced them, something so unlike him, as well as its hollow interpretations of scripture. So the temple and its leadership, when we talk about the temple and the leadership, We not only talk about the Jerusalem priesthood, the elite priesthood, because even among the priests there were categories. There were the poor priests, the Levitical priests, who were extremely very poor. But these priests were extremely rich. But there were also other rich lay people, like we have Joseph of Arimathea. We also know Nicodemus. They were rich people, and they were also part of the Sanhedrin. So when we talk about the Sanhedrin was not comprised only of the high priest, only the members of the high priestly families. There were also Pharisees, there were scribes who were experts in the Torah, and there were also lay people. But when we talk about the temple leadership in particular, it was the Sadducean priesthood that we referred to. Okay, the high priest, the chief priest. So let us go now to the central act of Jesus cleansing the temple. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to try out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priest and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city, went out probably on the Mount of Olives or back to Bethany probably. So this is the entire episode that we will be looking into today. Let us break down. This is a picture that I find it very inspiring, like how Jesus just turning all the tables of the money changers and the merchant. And normally they were all lined up here in the colonnade, in the temple's outer court. So here you have the huge pillars, okay, of the outer court, and along the porticos, all the merchants and the money changers would be lined up. So you can imagine what a busy place this must have been, and a place of very thriving commerce. Now, before we go on to that, let me explain to you how the Jerusalem temple was laid out. Okay, this is, sort of a construction, a model which is available in the Jerusalem Archaeology Museum. And from there, like we have picked up this. So when we talk about the temple was huge. This temple used to be called the second temple, which was, greatly renovated by King Herod. After the exiles, when they came back in 520 and so and started rebuilding the temple, it was very difficult for the exiles to garner funds and do it up. So the temple was not, when we see in the Old Testament, the prophets and all used to denounce the people that they did not bother to rebuild the temple to its former glory, because Solomon's temple was very, very beautiful. So it is only Herod who greatly enlarged. In fact, the temple courts and all were not so very big. He greatly enlarged the big plazas. So the way the temple was laid out was, the temples in ancient times always had a tripartite division. Not only the Jerusalem temple, but all the temples, if you look in Mesopotamia in the ancient time, any temple was always laid out in three parts. The innermost sanctum, which was called the Holy of Holies. Okay. Then inside the Holy of Holies, nobody could go except the high priest, and that too on the day of Yom Kippur. Okay. And that also, he had to take the sacrificial blood and enter over there and sprinkle it. So only the high priest was able to go. The rest of the priests, this used to be the court of the priest. This was also called the priestly sanctuary. So all the sacrificing, the altar used to be here, okay, just outside. The altar used to be here, and all the sacrificing and all used to be done by the priest. So slaughtering the animals and all used to be done by the priests themselves. So they were trained in this work. So the entire priestly sanctuary was here. Outside this, okay, this whole area was considered to be the court of Israel. It was meant only for the Jewish men. Outside this, beyond that, at a lower level, which this arrow doesn't exactly indicate, but somewhere here, but on a lower level used to be the court of women, and much lower than that was the entire court. This outside was the entire court of the Gentiles, which was a very, very huge area. All this part, okay, constituted the court of the Gentiles. This is another replica image, okay, in the Israel Museum, which shows like this is the Holy of Holies. Then this side is a priestly sanctuary. Then outside is, this used to be the steps, okay. The Levitical priest would stand along the steps of the temple, and they would play their flutes and their lyres and all, okay. So, and then you have the court for the men. Beyond that, the court for women. And this side, this is the entire court for the Gentiles. Let us go back to the Temple Cleansing Act. Some scholars don't like the label cleansing. They prefer to refer to it as a prediction of the destruction of the temple. But if you look closely, it is actually both. It is a symbolic cleansing act, but it is also a prediction, a very strong, okay, parable that Jesus is actually demonstrating that this is the place which will be brought down very soon. So it actually is both. It is cleansing and the prediction of the fall of the temple. But it is not a full cleansing of the temple, because we cannot call it entirely cleansing act, because Jesus was not able to do that in that one, okay, action of maybe that probably lasted half an hour to 1 hour. He was not able to cleanse and purify the temple completely. For that, he would have to actually lock the priest up, okay. Nobody, he would have had to block their access to go to the priestly sanctuary, and stop the sacrifices being carried out and denying them access to the sanctuary. This would get him immediately arrested. Had he done something like that, he would have been immediately been arrested by the cohort of the temple police. There was something called the temple police, okay, the temple guards. They were in the full-time pay of the temple, and these were Jewish people. The Roman soldiers used to be on top at that, that fortress Antonia. In that picture, it is not that much visible. So they would be over there. But the temple police were the one. They are also the ones who would actually, come and arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. We will see that later. So the temple police were always on the round, all over the temple. And they used to be, very, you can imagine what type of men police are. So they were the temple police and in the pay of the temple. So this act of Jesus overchanging the money changers' tables and hunting out on the temple merchants over there who were selling doves and as sacrificial animals, this whole scene is unfolding in the outer court of the temple, which would be a very crowded place, as at this point of time we have to remember it was nearing Passover. And during Passover, thousands of people would throng to the temple, and they would be coming not only from Judea proper, but also from Galilee, Perea, and the diaspora. And when we talk about the diaspora means outside, from foreign lands. Diaspora Jews were huge. They were there in Babylon, they were there in Cyrenaica, they were there in Egypt. So diaspora, in fact, the Jews in the diaspora were a huge, population, much compared to those who are resident in Judea and Galilee. So it would be a very busy time of the year for Jerusalem. The Hallel, okay, that Psalm, remember, 13 to 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This was the psalm that was being sung when he was being welcomed into the city. This would be common practice, and the sounds of the psalms would be, reverberating in the air, because they were sung all the time by the pilgrims making their way to Jerusalem. Later on, I will be explaining also, not only the Hallel psalms, much more than there was something called the Psalms of Ascent. When I show you the pilgrim road later, I will dwell on that. So these songs, would be there on the ears of all the pilgrims. And you can imagine, okay, how many people were flocking there. Josephus, I put it out in a later slide. Josephus, the Jewish historian, when he was writing his magnum opus, that great book of his, the Wars, Bellum Judaicum, he mentions that in 66 AD, when the revolt broke out, and it broke out around the time, a little after Passover, and the people were trapped. And he says that almost around 3 million people made it to the Passover of 66 AD. So, you can have a sense of an estimate like what a place it must have been, because it held great reverence for the people, especially for the Jews all over the world, especially the ones in the diaspora. So they would come, all the way for, especially for all the three pilgrim festivals. Which were they? You had the Passover, you had the Pentecost, and you had the Tabernacle. These were three great main feasts wherein assembling in Jerusalem was almost like mandatory. So those people, those who were from abroad and all, they also would try to come and make it to the Jerusalem temple. So hence it's unlikely that it drew everybody's attention, because when this action of Jesus overturning this money changers tables and all, Mark doesn't mention to us that he took a whip, okay, he took some cords and tied it and made it into a whip. John tells us that in his gospel. He literally took the whip and began whipping these people out. So whatever he did, it was a symbolic action, okay, and must have not lasted too long. So because had it been, okay, prolonged, the Roman soldiers at once were stationed in the fortress Antonia, which is just adjacent to the temple, would rush down and detain Jesus. So Jesus was very shrewd and clever always. Whenever he acted, he always saw that he, kept within the limits, because his time had not yet come. So it probably is a symbolic action that wouldn't keep back people for too long. The buying and selling took place in the porticos of the court of the Gentiles, which was the largest area of the temple precincts. But whatever, no matter how long this action of Jesus lasted, it rattled the Jerusalem priesthood, the temple leadership mind, because nobody had ever dared to do something like this. And this Galilean peasant, okay, according to them, this rabbi, he comes and he shakes them up completely to their core. So let us go ahead and see. In similar fashion, what Jesus does echoes Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, one of the best prophets that we have in the Old Testament corpus. He also, symbolically had smashed a pot in the temple to symbolize the impending destruction of the first temple. Remember, he kept on and on predicting that the temple would fall, that the king of Babylon would come. He wanted the king at that point of time, Zedekiah, to make, peace with the Babylonian emperor, but the entire elite at that point of time, they disregarded, they chose to, ignore his advice, and they made pact with the other kings then. That was the reason it brought the entire might of Nebuchadnezzar, and the way he came and destroyed the temple, we all know that, how the Jews were carried into exile. So during that time, Jeremiah, through his prophetic actions, one of the actions that he performed is he went into the temple and he smashed the pot in the temple to symbolize that this temple, like this pot, would be broken and destroyed. But what happened? This act didn't go down very well with the temple authorities. And at that point of time, the temple authorities, even the king was considered to be the temple authority. And he ends up being beaten and thrown in the stocks. And during that time, there was also, if you read in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 26, Jeremiah also tells us about another prophet, unnamed prophet. We don't know his name. He also came to the Jerusalem temple, and he also prophesied about its coming destruction. But what happened to him? Unlike Jeremiah was put in the stocks. He was once later on towards the end also thrown into a deep cistern. Why? Because just as there were detractors of Jeremiah, there were also other people in the king's court who deeply admired Jeremiah, and they were supporters. So though he had a strong, force of people against him, he also had people who, took care of it. Also, we know that Nebuchadnezzar and his emissaries also had heard about the work of Jeremiah, how he was trying to convince the people to take the path of peace. So definitely when the temple fell, Jeremiah was not taken as a captive to Babylon. He was kept back. But finally he was smuggled and taken to Egypt with the remnant that was there. Okay, that is another story for some other time. But the thing is that whenever prophets stood up and spoke against the Jerusalem temple, okay, be it the first temple, the second temple, they always, most of the time, ended up, losing their life most of the time. So here, Jesus also, okay, echoes Jeremiah. And finally, it is this particular act of Jesus, we know, that finally will take him to his death. So similarly, a generation after Jesus' ministry and death, Josephus, most of our information outside the Bible comes from this historian Josephus. He reports about a Joshua ben Ananias, also called Jesus ben Ananias. In his that same book was, in this particular book 6, he mentions about this man who during the tumultuous time, the first Jewish revolt, when the revolt broke out in 66 AD, much later, generation after Jesus had died, okay, he came into the temple and prophesied, woe to the temple, woe to Jerusalem, judgment is coming. So when they saw, they were on collision course with the Romans and the Roman army was coming to destroy them, he was prophesying. And what they did not like this because people were getting scared. With somebody coming and prophesying against the Jerusalem temple was taken as a great insult. So he, unlike Jesus, doesn't turn tables or smash a pot like Jeremiah, but the chief priest who run the temple establishment have him arrested all the same. That time I think it was the high priest was Ananias, a very corrupt man. Okay, they have him arrested and hand him over to the Roman governor, who has him flogged till, as Josephus records, his bones showed. The flesh was so badly ripped, he was so badly flogged that probably he must have died, we do not know. But he was released, he didn't die of this flogging. The Roman governor then let him go, as everybody thought that he was insane and harmless and doesn't have a following. Why was he released? Because he was coming, no doubt, and he was screaming at the top of his voice, woe to the temple and woe to Jerusalem. But this man had no disciples, he had no followers. So from that point of view, he was pretty harmless. He couldn't be, do much damage. But in Jesus' case, that is not the thing. Jesus had a huge following, and they don't think he is insane. The chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees who are there, part of the Sanhedrin probably, they don't think that Jesus is, insane like that man, like Jesus ben Ananias. They know very well, okay, he is totally in his senses. Not only that, but he's an extremely sharp and intelligent, okay, rabbi, whatever they would like to call him. He is seen as a big threat, a potential rival to their influence with the people. So this was the key. What was the core? What was the source from where their envy, like poison, poisoned their mind so much? It is, they viewed Jesus as a big threat. Why? Because he was a rival to their influence with the people. Remember when we read that? When he began teaching and he was, referring to the scriptures, especially what Jeremiah, okay, said, and especially we will see also, he quotes Isaiah 56. He was teaching the people, making them realize that this is a place which is meant to be the house of God. And it is a place that is meant for everybody, not selectively people are allowed to come here. So here he was teaching them, and that is the reason so much of hatred and envy was aroused in this people, because he exercised great influence on the minds of the people. People were spellbound with his teaching, and especially with the way he connected with the scriptures of the Old Testament. So this definitely tells us that Jesus was extremely well schooled in the OT scriptures. So the Sadducees, of course, had many rivals. Okay, chief among them was within them only the Pharisees were their greatest rivals. Why? Because the Pharisees were very popular with the people, unlike them. The Sadducees were the same people who didn't believe in the Pharisaic traditions, the oral Torah. They never accepted the oral Torah, which was, always, held up in high esteem by the Pharisees. The Sadducees only upheld the Pentateuch, only the Torah, nothing beyond that. oral Torah, they, always said that that was manufactured, engineered by the Pharisees. Definitely the Sadducees had rivals even within the people who were very influential. So the Sadducees, the Sadducean priesthood were the dominant clan. We cannot call them, actually a group of people like, the Essenes were one group, like we had the Pharisees were there. They were religious groups, but Sadducees were not a group. They were a clan. Clan means only, a group of your own close communities, your own families coming together, extended families coming together becomes a clan. And the Sadducees were nothing beyond that. They were a clan, and they always claimed their lineage from the priest Zadok from the time of Solomon. Okay, so they were the dominant clan from amongst the aristocratic priests that ran the temple. So they were the rulers of the temple. They were the actual political masters ruling Judea with closest ties to the Roman governor. The Roman governor during Jesus' time, of course, was Pontius Pilate. So who was the man with whom Pontius Pilate would, collaborate? He was a foreigner over there in Judea. So of course it was a Sadducean priesthood, the high priest, the chief priest. They were all the ones with whom the Romans enjoyed a clout. So they were the ones with the biggest political clout during this time. And it is these people Jesus is attacking when he is attacking the temple leadership. Jesus quotes a couple of Bible verses to expose their hollowness. And what does he quote first? First he quotes a very beautiful quote. Jesus quotes Isaiah 56. Okay, Isaiah 56 is from 3rd Isaiah, 3 to Isaiah, and this was a prophet. Okay, he was after the exile period. Okay, you have prophets who are pre-exilic before the exile, then you have exilic prophets, and then you have post-exilic prophets. So 3 to Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah, from which chapter 56 comes. Okay, he was a post-exilic prophet and a prophet of great consolation, because they always, because when the first temple was destroyed and the people were carried into exile, it was a great psychological shock for the people. They never believed that God would abandon, his people and allow his temple to be rampaged by people who have nothing to do with God. So here, when Isaiah 56, when Jesus is quoting, what is the thing that he quotes? This is the text I put. Jesus goes ballistic. Okay, he is like coming all guns blazing. Quoting Isaiah 56, and the context is that eunuchs and foreigners will be welcome in my house. And specifically in that verse, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. This is what Jesus emphasizes. Let us see. The actual text reads like this. These faithful eunuchs and foreigners I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Okay, so you see the vision, okay, of Isaiah, be it first, second, or third Isaiah. This was a vision, this was God's vision for all mankind. And when the Jerusalem temple was set up, it was meant to be a house of prayer where people of all nations would come. But what had the people later on done? And especially during the time of Jesus, they had, actually segregated the people coming. See, when we talk about the temple, remember, lepers couldn't come, people who had, physical deformities and all, they were considered to be ritually impure. So this purity regulations that were all, done up by the Pharisees and all, the so-called Pharisaic traditions, wherein the purity laws became very, very stringent and became to be very strictly imposed. These were the things that Jesus is actually, taking a shot against. Twice in this verse, God's temple is called a house of prayer. God's design for his house in Jerusalem to be a gathering place for worshippers from all nations, a place where prayers would rise like incense from the hearts of the faithful into the presence of the living God. This was the vision of God when he put his name constantly that phrase will be used later. I've put my name here into this place. This is my place, a house of prayer, and it will be called a house of prayer. So this was what? But during the time of Jesus, and especially when this act is unfolding, could we say that really this was a place where foreigners and all could come? Yes, the foreigners were allowed, but let us see what had they done. They had changed the traditions. Okay, they were not only tradition, they had actually changed whatever was written in the Tanakh. Okay, to suit their own needs. So we'll see how. To understand the relevance of this, we need to recall the binding purity regulations and the traditions that developed during the Second Temple period. When Herod massively expanded and rebuilt the Second Temple, which was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world because it was really like a masterpiece. He had priests trained as stonemasons. Why? Because they couldn't, the purity regulation they were imposing very, very strictly, that though Herod had the best of intentions to make the temple a very beautiful place, something that would be the cynosure of everybody's eyes, he had priests trained as stonemasons. Why? Because he couldn't bring other people outside. No matter how good a master craftsman he was, he couldn't come. Why? Because they were not allowed to enter the precincts of the temple. And that is the reason Herod finally, when he undertook the plans to renovate the temple, he had to draw out the priests who could be trained as stonemasons in keeping the purity regulations. They also helped to redesign. So these priests who were trained as stonemasons, not only they, but the others who were good at architecture, they can redesign the architecture of the renovated temple, which was unlike that of the first temple of Solomon. Okay, the first temple of Solomon, this was the way the layout of the temple was. The first came the holy place, which was called the Holy of Holies. Then came the priestly sanctuary. Then came the outer court where everybody was welcome. So it was just a simple tripartite division, okay, wherein, finally the innermost sanctum was the Holy of Holies. And we know this was the case because in the book of 1 Kings, that was during the time of David and Solomon, and everybody is chronicled in 1 and 2 Kings. In the book of 1 Kings chapter 8, at the time of the dedication of the temple, when Solomon had completed building the first temple, there was a grand dedication of the temple. And during the dedication of the temple, Solomon had made this specific prayer. He had prayed that when Gentiles come to this place or foreigners come to this place, they feel welcome to worship the God of Israel. So where was this vision? How was this vision lost during the Second Temple, especially during the time of Jesus, where foreigners were not allowed to enter, okay, beyond the outer court? Nobody was allowed, even women, the Jewish women were not allowed. And here Solomon is praying that may Jerusalem, the newly built temple, become a place for the foreigners to come and worship the God of Israel. So this vision, you see, was lost when Herod undertook the rebuilding of the temple. And we cannot blame Herod for this, because who were the people who were calling the shots? Who were the decision-making body as to how, what can be and what cannot be done? It wasn't Herod. Herod had the intention of beautifying the temple, so he mobilized massive resources. But finally, what had to be laid out? What was a call that had to be taken by the Jerusalemite priesthood? So this vision, which was of Isaiah, which is also echoed much earlier in the book of Kings, as expressed by King Solomon, was lost by the time Jesus arrives on the scene. But in the period by the time of Jesus, we had the most holy place, then the priestly sanctuary, and the outer court. These two things remain the same. But see how the layout changed. The outer court was divided into 3 sections. Court of Israel for Jewish men. On a lower level outside that, the court of women, as women were considered less pure. Something like this wasn't there in the first temple. And outside that, on a still lower level, was the massive court of the Gentiles, where this whole action of the cleansing of the temple unfolds, which was the only place Gentiles could go. There were welcome signs for the Gentiles along the barricades of the court for women. So beyond the court of, even in the court of women, the Gentiles couldn't enter. So on the outer barricade of the court of the women, there were warning signs, and we know these things existed because archaeological excavations have revealed. I'll put out the pictures now shortly, that tell us that these things did exist. It is not something that was made up, which warned the Gentiles. We call them welcome signs, but it was a sign that you are not welcome. The irony of it, which warned the Gentiles not to venture any further except under pain of death, which would shortly ensue. So when Jesus insists, what is he attacking? This practice of segregating people. Okay, when he insists that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, he is actually attacking their man-made traditions of segregating people, which is not God-willed, as what was willed by God has been subverted by their new traditions. And prayer here is a big thing. He is challenging the hypocrisy of the leaders concerning true prayer and worship. So what was happening when Jesus is doing it? It's a symbolic act. He's actually challenging, is this the kind of worship that is acceptable to the God of Israel? We have greatly mitigated and diluted it, okay, because of their own evil intentions. Let us go further. This is it. These are the two this, okay? Two proofs that we have. These were the welcome signs. This used to be inscribed and put there on the barricades of the women's court. This is something that is, today in the museum in Istanbul in Turkey. It was a thick marble slab with 7 lines inscribed in Greek, warning foreigners, non-Jews, from passing the balustrade of the temple and entering its sacred precincts, which were discovered in 1871 north of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The inscription, it is in Greek. It reads, "No foreigner is to enter within the balustrade and forecourt around the sacred precinct. Whoever is caught will himself be responsible for his consequent death." Okay, and this is in the Istanbul Museum in Turkey. This is the second one. Okay, a broken marble slab. This is with 6 lines. This was with 7. Inscribed again in Greek, was discovered in the area of the Lion's Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. It resides in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Having that, but it's a broken piece, okay? But when they go through the text, they very well know what it is. So these are both the quotations that Jesus uses to teach in the temple against the corrupt priesthood there. Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. Jesus now quotes Jeremiah. We are done now with Isaiah 56. He also quotes Jeremiah. And remember, I have already drawn the parallels between Jesus' act and that of Jeremiah breaking the pot in the first temple period. Okay. Then Jesus goes. He doesn't stop there. Remember, he's teaching. People are all listening to him, and so are all these leaders. Definitely, they all know what has happened, and they are all there in the outer court, and they are listening what he's saying. Then he quotes another text, that is Jeremiah 7:11. The context of which is this. Okay, it is like will you steal, commit adultery? It is like God asking them, the way like the attitudes of the elite had developed there in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem temple leadership. It is like, God is asking, will you steal, commit adultery, break the commands of God, commit all these sins, and then come into this house which is called by my name? This is the phrase, house called by my name. And you say to yourselves, we are free to do all these things because God won't judge his own house. In God we trust, we can't experience judgment. Okay, they have, induced a false sense of security upon themselves. Like even during the time of Jeremiah, because Jeremiah's quotation only we are putting, they thought that, no matter what transgressions we commit, God, because God has chosen to put his place there in the temple of his name, in the temple of Jerusalem, the temple will never come to any harm. So it was like, they felt like they have eternally got a sort of an insurance policy by which God, nobody would be able to, move them from the Jerusalem temple, and it would eternally stand to this day. But God proves that wrong. So it was a false sense of security that, was prevailing upon them. They carried on doing all the wrong. Jeremiah constantly told them, come back to the Lord, mend your ways. But everything falls on deaf ears. And the text goes on to say, what is more important is, when you read the quote of Jeremiah, this is, something very telling. I will do to this house, which is called by my name, what I did to Shiloh. What is Shiloh? Much before the first temple was built by Solomon, the Ark of the Covenant, remember, was carried through the wilderness. Okay, they built the Ark of the Covenant. The tabernacle was built in the desert, and the desert tabernacle always carried the Ark of the Covenant. So when the tabernacle, before the temple was built, that was like a mobile temple that was on the move. And it was stationed in the place called Shiloh, which is very close to, Samaria today, like near the town of Shechem. So this used to be the place where, prior to the Jerusalem temple, which was built by Solomon, Shiloh used to be the place which used to be the central sanctuary of the Israelites. So when Jeremiah was saying, I will do to this house which is called by my name what I did to Shiloh, he is referring to the capture of the Ark of the Covenant by the Philistines. This was a time in the book of Samuel we come across Eli and his sons. Okay, Eli was a good man, he was a good priest, but his sons, okay, during the time of the judges, they were very corrupt men, and that is why God brought his judgment on the people at that point of time. And the Philistines, okay, routed the Israelites, and the Ark of the Covenant was taken away, was captured by the Philistines. And the current, there are, ongoing excavations at Shiloh. Even if you go and Google it, you will be able to see lots of pictures. All these things are revealed. So it is like a big slap on the face of the people who say that the Old Testament is all made up, it is myth, it is fiction. But these things are crying out and testifying the authenticity of the Bible. So here when Jeremiah was referring, he was referring to what had happened to Shiloh. God had abandoned, though it was a central sanctuary, he allowed that to be devastated because that was brought upon the people by their acts of transgression, especially by being fidelity to the covenant was what God always expected. So when they broke on that promise, okay, the full judgment was brought to bear upon the people. And so the Ark of the Covenant was captured by Philistines. It remained there for a big number of years, and it is only King David finally who brought it. Okay, he defeated the Philistines and brought it in procession, and then it was housed, very close to I think Beth Shemesh was a place where it remained for a long time. And then when the temple was built, it was brought in the first temple. Okay, so here Jeremiah had warned them sufficiently that if you don't mend your ways, and don't be under the impression that God will protect his central sanctuary of the Jerusalem temple and you will remain unscathed and untouched. God will do to this house also what he did to the central sanctuary at Shiloh. Okay. These are the quotes that I have put out. Okay, this used to be, the desert tabernacle. This used to be on the move most of the time. Finally, when they came to Shiloh, we know that more or less, a sort of a structure was built up, and the Ark of the Covenant was housed here. When this is very when Eli was given the news that the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, he died there, okay, on the spot. You know that. So here this was prophesied. So the Philistines fought and Israel was defeated and they fled every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell, and the ark of God was captured. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died in that battle. And Eli also, on receiving this news, he also died. And this is the one. Okay. To my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first. Okay, I did what I did to it will also be done to the people of Judea at that point of time. I think I'll just redo the slide properly because some words have come there. I'm sorry for that. So Jesus continues, has this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your sight? Den of robbers, see how Jesus uses this. It's precisely where robbers store their loot, isn't it? And their plunder. And that is how we call it a den of robbers, because they keep on looting and plundering, and there is a place of safety where they hide all their loot, their spoils. The temple leaders thought the temple was their refuge and they could forever be saved from God's judgment. So what we conclude from here is, so here we have the Jerusalem temple that has become a segregated institution, and Jesus comes here in all fury and insists emphatically the will of God that this is to be a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a robber's den. The leadership is corrupt and it's calling out for judgment on itself.